Well, I think everybody has that second cup of coffee. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Kent Hughes. I run a program here on science, technology, America, and the global economy. For those of you that are new to the Wilson Center, let me just say a word or two about the center. The center is a living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. When the Congress decided to honor President Wilson, they decided against another monument or marble statue and created this living memorial that was designed really to capture both sides of Wilson's life. President Wilson was the only president in American history to have had a PhD, and in his era he was a very prominent political scientist. So the mission that we were given was to try to bring together the people who were doing the best thinking about policy, together with the people who are on the front lines of making policy, or more broadly in Washington and elsewhere around the country, people who are actively influencing the making of policy. And today, we're turning to the question of education, a world that, of course, formed so much of Woodrow Wilson's life. And I think it's fair to say, as much as any single force, education is going to define the future of the United States in terms of the country that we would like it to be, and certainly in terms of the economy we would like it to have. We've got lots of strengths in education. If you look at, say, the Financial Times list of leading research universities, you always see a healthy representation of American institutions. In fact, often American universities dominate that list. But I'm afraid if you look at the K through 12 system, you see an enormous variety. Just a few miles from here, there's Thomas Jefferson University, a magnet school. Math, science is its focus. First school in the world, first high school in the world to have had its own supercomputer. And just a few miles from Thomas Jefferson, and a little closer to us, you'll find schools where perhaps half the students drop out before finishing a standard high school curriculum. I think the U.S. hopefully is on its way to being a learning organization or a learning country. You hear a lot about this in the business world. We're a learning company. Well, I think the U.S. in the past has been and needs to be a learning country. In the 1980s, faced with the challenge of German and Japanese manufacturing, the U.S. looked at our own history, it looked around the world, and discovered that both Japan and Germany had different systems, but very effective systems at getting the latest technology to small and medium-sized businesses. We kind of drew on that experience on our own past and developed the Manufacturing Extension Program, which now really reaches virtually every small manufacturer in the United States. So we're turning that kind of thinking to the world of education. And we're fortunate today to have a group that will help us take a look at the international tests where the U.S. has really had kind of a middling performance in terms of math and science. If you look at those tables, you'll find that in many cases there are quite a list of European countries that are doing better than we are, at least as measured by those tests. And I'm delighted to say, have an all-star panel to take a look at these particular questions. Let me introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. To my far right, to your far left, we have Andreas Schleicher, who currently heads the Indicators and Analysis Division of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. As you know, the OECD is, in a sense, a think tank for the industrial world. He also oversees the Program for International Student Assessment. The next speaker, to my left and your far right, is Mr. William Schmidt, Professor William Schmidt. He is the University Distinguished Professor at Michigan State, and distinguished is certainly the right word when you look at his list of activities and publications. As part of his professional life, he served as the National Research Coordinator for the organization that oversees U.S. participation in the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, another study that got a lot of attention here because, at least by some measures, U.S. students didn't do as well as we would hope. To my immediate right, and your near left, I guess I'd say, Iris Rotberg will be batting cleanup, I guess you'd say, today. She is a professor of education at the Graduate School of Education at the George Washington University. She brings a wealth of professional experience and publications to this question, and I should really give her recent book that she's edited a plug called Balancing Change and Tradition in Global Education Reform, in which she and her co-authors take a very useful look at a whole series of education reform efforts in a number of countries around the world. Well, let me turn now the program over to you, Andreas.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Before I turn to PISA and our results on schooling, I just want to give you a glimpse on the pace of change that we see in education. If you look to the last 10, 15 years, sort of every education system is improving somewhat by national standards. We haven't seen any decline anywhere in the world in terms of performance standards, but we are seeing also that the improvement is at a very different speed across the world. This chart is a bit complicated, but I'll explain it carefully. On the horizontal axis here you see, and it's about higher education, which is sort of the defining aspect of competitiveness today in the OECD world, in principal industrialized countries. On the horizontal axis you see how successful systems are in getting lots of people towards completing college education or an equivalent vocational degree. On the vertical axis you see how much it costs per student. And every dot that you see is a country. I'm going to make it a bit more complicated by bringing one dimension into this, which is who pays for this. The size of the bullet is the capacity of countries to mobilize private resources for education. How much can you draw on private expenditure? And here you see the United States, number one in terms of graduate output, number one in terms of spending per student, and number one on tying with Japan in terms of mobilizing a lot of resources from private sources of funds. No? That's Japan, that's the United States. The only thing I haven't stressed so far that this was in 1995, about a decade ago. And when you actually see how the picture looked in the year 2000, you could see that many countries in a 5-year period actually began to move up to that frontier, defined by the United States in terms of the output. You can look, for example, at Australia. Very effective in moving from the middle of the pack right to the frontier. Or you can look at Finland. Finland in the north of Europe. Before you could see it somewhere here. In a 5-year period, getting lots of more people completing college education or equivalent qualification. Now suddenly being number one. So all I'm saying here is that the world really changes very quickly on a rapid pace. What was the defining standards in 1995 is now suddenly the frontier reached by many countries. And the world didn't stop as many people predicted in the year 2000. There's been actually lots of change since then. If you look 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. Now, see, basically in one, sort of in 10 years, the pace of change has been so different that the global talent pool has dramatically changed across countries. Here you can see the United States more or less where it stood. It also slightly moved to the right, but by far not as fast as most other countries. It's moved more upwards. Education has been become more expensive, but not necessarily more in terms of output. Here you see Australia. Here you see Finland, those countries really that moved up quite high. And sort of on the title of today's session here, it's not just Europe where we have seen in some European countries improvement. You can see that improvement in Asia and Australia and Canada, sort of lots of interesting examples that you can look at. But that's just the pace of change that we've seen. And since we're talking about science, let me show you the same picture about science education as well. This is how the world looked in 95 in science. In science is an area where the United States has never been number one. You have Japan that has led the world for a long time in terms of graduate output in the science areas. But basically, again, you see that's the picture in 1995. And then you could see Sweden, also a country very successful. And the fact that the dot is small basically suggests that Sweden actually manages to finance its entire system of colleges through public investments. No? Almost at the same level as the United States, and also very successful in getting lots of people to science qualifications. No? And then basically, again, the year 2000, dramatic changes, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. Now you can see sort of the pace of development moving to the right across the world. And we can see actually that development continuing. We now have data. We're going to publish them in September about 2007, and you can see sort of things move up. That brings me to the area of schooling. There, basically, through our PISA assessment, we're not just looking at how many people get a qualification, but we're much more interested in the quality, the kind of skills that people bring with them. So every 3 years, we do a test in basically the major school subjects, whether it's reading, math, science, and so on, to see to what extent young people at the age of 15 can master those kind of subject areas. And you can see that test covers now most of the industrialized world, really. About almost 90% of the world economy is now covered. And so we have a pretty good picture of the skills and competencies of young people in school. Why is it so important? Because that's the foundation for all skill acquisition afterwards. In fact, we do have longitudinal data that suggests how powerful a predictor skills at age 15 are for the future chances, life chances of people. We have that data now for Canada, Australia, Denmark, and it's on the one hand encouraging that what you've learned at age 15 matters for your life. On the other hand, quite frightening how small the chances are for people who have not acquired baseline qualifications at age 15 to catch up. Anyway, that's the countries. I'm going through this quickly. This is a map showing you two things. On the vertical axis, you see quality of learning outcomes, the performance of young people. In this case, it's science, but it doesn't vary that much across subject areas. You can see a European countries on top of that list. That's Finland. But you have countries in Asia doing really well, countries in North America, like Canada, doing well. So it's quite a mixed group of countries across cultures. It's not sort of one culture that dominates the education league tables, but you can see that really quite across continent and cultures. Some countries really doing well, and at the same time, some countries doing quite poorly. The gap between the countries you see on that screen is about equivalent to 3.5 school years at age 15. You can see really there's a large gap between better and poorer performing education systems. That's the vertical axis. And what I want to also show you, there's another dimension, and that's the horizontal axis. This talks about equity. It measures essentially the impact that social background has in different countries. It doesn't talk about social diversity in the countries. What this is about, what difference does social diversity make on your learning achievement? And you can see on the right side there, you see a number of countries. It's quite striking, actually. You can see, for example, Finland, Canada, Japan, Korea, Macau. These are countries where whatever social background you have, whatever the level of education of your parents or their income, you do succeed quite consistently well across the entire education system. On the left side of the chart, you can see some countries like Liechtenstein, Germany, Belgium, Hungary, France, or the United States that actually vary in their level of performance, but have something in common, that is social background is a main determinant of your actual life chances. And there are different reasons for this. Some of them are systemic. Some of them have to do with other factors and so on. But you can see that countries vary widely on the vertical axis, but they also do vary widely on their capacity to moderate the impact of social background. Why is that interesting? Because, I mean, this chart, of course, shows you how the world is, but it also shows you how the world can be. If you look sort of to the right upper corner marked in green there, you do see actually that there are a number of countries that are really successful in achieving high standards of quality and at the same time achieving equitable outcomes of education. What makes Finland sort of so special is that it's not just some schools doing so well, but you have only around 5% of the performance variability in student achievement between schools. So more or less every school succeeds in the country. Success is not just an idiosyncratic outcome of the system, but it's quite predictable. You can put your child almost in any part of the system, and at least once you found a school, you can rely on the distribution being quite similar across the entire country, and that's sort of an interesting facet there. Canada is quite successful as well, I think, in sort of providing equitable and consistent outcomes throughout the country, as is Japan and so on. Now, of course, the interesting part is what have we learned about this, what makes some systems more successful, some less so, and that's pretty tough to analyze. I mean, all we do is we do a photograph of the current situation, and we can see some features that those systems have in common or not, and to derive explanations from that, that leaves a lot sort of to interpretation. But I want to look at a few things that I think are quite important. I mean, the most commonly sort of suggestion is that spending more money on education will raise outcomes. No? But if you actually look at how money average spending shown here on the horizontal axis and performance of systems shown on the vertical axis are related, you don't see much of a relationship really. Not average spending on systems explains only about 20% of the performance variability that we do see across systems. Now, countries spend their money quite differently. The capacity of countries to devote the money where it makes most of a difference varies a lot across countries. Some systems have a lot of mechanisms in place to sort of channel the money to where the challenges are greatest, attracting the best teachers into the most challenging schools and so on. So that there's a lot of variation how the money is being used, as is there variation in the spending choices that countries make. And I want to just show you that the kind of choices, how countries spend their money, explains more variation across countries than just the amounts that are devoted to education. Look at this chart. First of all, I show you, and that's the red dot, how much money actually arrives in classrooms in relation to GDP per capita, spending capacity of countries. No? Where the dot is above the line, the horizontal line here, these are countries, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, Belgium, Korea, and so on. These countries spend quite a lot of money in relation to GDP per capita for education in the classroom. And then you can see here at the end of the United States, Poland, Slovak Republic spent comparatively less in relation to the spending capacity on classroom. Now you will tell me, well, you just told me that the United States was spending so much, and now you say that the United States spends so little. Part of the explanation is that the United States is one of the countries with a relatively small share of money that actually arrives in the classroom in terms of core instructional spending. So that explains the discrepancy between the previous in this chart. Plus, the United States is a rich country, so GDP is high, so spending on education relative to GDP per capita is low. But that's not the point I wanted to make. I want to really talk about the kind of choices. And I start not with a European country, but with a country in Asia, Korea, that made interesting choices because, you know, in the 1960s, Korea had the level of economic development of Afghanistan today, one of the least developed education systems in the OECD. And they actually they had very little money to spend at the beginning, but they invested their money quite strategically. Basically what they said is we want to attract the best people into the teaching profession, so we spend a lot on teacher salaries. That's the green bar, the relative spending component. Much more than other countries. Switzerland, sort of similar, but these are countries that have said we want to put a lot of money to attract people into the teaching profession, which is not the case in the United States. Teacher spending relative to spending capacity is somewhat below the OECD average. The Koreans have also said we want to buy a lot of teaching time, learning time for students. We want to send them to school for long hours. That also costs money, so that's driving costs in Korea up as well. And there's a third thing that the Koreans said. They say, well, we want to make sure that our teachers continue to learn, continue to work. They don't just do teaching, but they do lots of things other than teaching in school. And that also costs money. No? If you buy time for teachers to do other things than teaching, you have to pay for it. And what you see here is that there's a lot of spending pressures going upwards. This is what Korea would spend if everything else would be equal. And actually, the red dot shows you what they actually spend. So where's the secret? The secret is that they buy most of that with large classes. Korea said, well, we want the best people, we want to spend lots of instruction time, we want to give teachers opportunities other than for teaching. And we pay for this with large classes. Pick the next country, Luxembourg. It spends roughly the same as Korea. No? The red dot is at the same level, but it spends its money very differently. Luxembourg says, well, our parents like small classes, our teachers like small classes, let's put our money on that. And the consequences, since you can't spend your money twice, is that instruction hours are well below the OECD average. They can't have much time if you have small classes. Teachers can't do much beyond teaching, at least not paid, and then the salaries are just around the average level. So here you can see basically how spending choices impact that. And when you actually see, I mean, it's very hard to sort of build correlations here, but most successful education systems sort of are more like the Koreans. If you look, for example, to Finland in Europe here, also there, I mean, it's not as extreme. They're more sort of like a typical average country, but they tend to buy success with large classes rather than cutting on other spending. And the United States is a bit more than Luxembourg. No? The cost driver upwards lies in smaller classes. Downward pressure comes from paying teachers relatively low and also having very little time for things other than teaching. But the point I wanted to make is simply that those spending choices are quite an important factor. But I want to look beyond spending. What other things have we identified? One of the things that comes out in most of our work is that high-performing systems, whether in Europe or in Asia, have quite clearly defined performance expectations. They articulate clearly what good performance means, and they do that in ways that is consistent across subjects. They call it national standards, national curriculum, whatever name they choose. It's something that teachers recognize, it's something that students recognize. You can even see that through the eyes of students when you ask them at age 15 what their expectations are. You can see in those systems that tends to be clearly articulated expectations on what good performance is. Now in Europe, it's quite interesting. It's not necessarily telling teachers what to teach, particularly the northern European countries. They don't articulate what content teachers should cover. They articulate what good performance means, and then it's up to teachers and schools to figure out what they do about it. But they do something else as well, and that is they have strong support systems, identifying good teachers. You see, take some countries as different as Korea and Finland. What they have in common is that they've made teaching a very competitive profession. In Finland, you have 9 applications for 1 post. It's not just money. It has to do, to a large extent, with the kind of, at least that's what teachers say in surveys, is that it has to do with the working environment that are being offered. If you put those dimensions together, the degree of challenge in the system, the nature of the support systems, when the expectations are low and the support systems are weak, probably nobody would expect much. Many systems, particularly in the early 80s, have just moved up the challenges, introduced national tests, national accountability systems, and so on, without building much of the support systems. England was the first country going that route, and it's not always been successful. We have some countries, also in Europe, that are very strong in their support systems, but not very clear in what their expectations are. Denmark, Norway are typical examples. No? They're very similar systems to the top performer Finland, but where they differ is in the way they articulate their performance expectations. So it comes down, at least that's our interpretation, that it is the combination of clear ambitions, high expectations, and at the same time strong support systems, getting the best teachers into the classrooms and backing them up with good professional development. And that's something we actually studied quite recently with a new survey as well, where we looked at those kinds of mechanisms in more detail. That's one dimension. A second dimension, I'm going through this quickly, is that we do see a strong emphasis on schools in many of the successful systems. And again, it's whether you look at Finland in Europe or Canada in North America or Japan and Korea in Asia. All of these countries put a lot of responsibility on schools. And that's an interesting facet. Like, you would argue that the United States is also quite devolved education system with a lot of local control, but actually in our surveys, when we look at the relative degrees of discretion that schools have, they tend to be not at the top end. Sort of, it's more at other local levels of responsibility, but the school itself doesn't tend to be sort of the main driver of work, which is what we see in some of those systems. But at the same time, those systems also have the capacity to intervene when things go wrong. That's, I think, something that we're seeing more and more. People call it things like intelligent accountability, and that is not necessarily just about vertical accountability, test-driven accountability, but it often is much more about lateral accountability, how you build networks of schools that drive innovation, how you make sure that the teacher knows what's happening in the next classroom, schools know what happens in other schools. So it's the nature of accountability systems varies a lot across countries. And we're just beginning to understand those differences. And the sort of common approach in the United States to accountability is not particularly common either in Asia or in Europe. It's one end of the spectrum. Probably the country that comes closest to this in Europe would be the United Kingdom, or England in particular. Scotland already is quite different again. So there's a lot of variation between sort of vertical test-based accountability systems and other forms of accountability. I mean, our measure of the success of those systems is always the between-school variability of performance. No? When schools achieve consistently high performance, you can argue, well, something must work in the accountability system. When there's a lot of variability, you can ask yourself that question. But that's basically one dimension that we have. I just wanted to show you how those things work together, those two factors. This chart is a bit complicated. It shows you sort of one dimension of school-level responsibility. It's basically the capacity of schools to hire their own teachers. But you could more or less substitute most of the factors that we have measured in terms of school-level responsibilities. Here on that axis you have the extent to which systems work under what we call standards-based external assessments, examinations. Sort of, it's a proxy for, is there a common yardstick that measures success for schools, and is that known, and does it make a difference for students, for their future life? And when you actually look at how those four groups of schools perform, when you pool the whole data set, you can see, for example, here the schools that have very little local discretion and work without a framework of external standards, they tend to be the lowest performing schools on average across OECD countries. And that holds even after accounting for social background. You have schools that have no local discretion but do operate in a framework of external standards. And you can see they perform already 46 points on the PISA scale better, and that is more than a school year. So that difference is quite large. We don't know whether that is the cause for their higher performance, but it's an association that at least warrants that one looks deeper into those kinds of relationships. Here you have schools that have a lot of local discretion and no standards. Typically, often these are private schools. They can do what they want, and they are not really bound by external standards. But not only. You have also education systems that fall into that category. If you look, for example, one of the high-performing systems that falls into that category is the Flemish Community of Belgium. Very well-performing system. Not that clear in terms of external standards, but it's more or less you would call it a system of charter schools, but for all students, more or less. 70% of the students choose the school that the parents want. But you can see actually the highest level of performance is achieved by the schools that have both aspects. On the one hand, local discretion, and on the other hand, clearly defined external standards. You can look at one other aspect, and I just want to highlight that when I talk about local discretion, local responsibility, I do not talk about whether these are public or private schools. In fact, that distinction matters much less than you think. When you look, for example, this is a distribution of public and private schools across countries. And you can see some countries, here's the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on. There's some countries where private schools, are Korea and Ireland, it's very common. The light green bar are, in your terminology, charter schools, publicly funded private schools, and the dark green bar are independent private schools. They're not very common. I think the United States is more or less an exception in having those kinds of schools, but they're not so common. But what you can actually see when you look at the results, in the majority of countries it looks as if private schools do better, but when you take out social background, you can see actually that nothing is left of that. So when I talk about local discretion, it's not about whether school systems are publicly run or privately run. It's not the question in a sense how many charter schools you have, but it's more a question of how systems have made every public school a school that assumes sort of charter type local responsibility. And that is the case in some of the education systems. If you look, for example, today, take two European countries, you take Sweden or the United Kingdom, schools essentially get 3 yearly budgets, and they have to figure out whom they hire, how they work, how they spend their money, and so on. So there's a lot of responsibility on schools to manage their own affairs. And that is an increasing, you can actually see changes in that trend over the last years. But it's not that the share of private schools increases, it's just that the local responsibility of public schools has dramatically changed. Teachers hire and so on, those decisions are now often made at local school levels. This is just, and I will not go much on further, this is just an analysis when you try to put all of those school factors together, what actually makes a difference across systems. Schools that practice a lot of ability grouping tend on average to perform a bit worse than everybody else. It's hard to understand that. You think that ability grouping, sorting people into different tracks and streams might do something good, but it doesn't seem to be associated with better performance. On the reverse, when you have schools that are academically selective, you can see them doing better, and that's pretty obvious. If you can select your clients, you'd expect to do better. And the first thing we ask ourselves is, well, if that works, why don't you see it on a system level? What if you make every school selective? Sort of, is it a system factor as well? And it is not, actually. We don't see any system-wide effect for countries that practice that more generally than others. This is interesting, very controversial. Schools that posted their results publicly tended to perform better even after accounting for everything else. So it's not just sort of an artificial factor here of social background and so on. And it even holds after accounting for social background. You know, I should have said this at the beginning, but this bar is what we observe. This is what we would have observed if all student schools and systems had the same kind of social context. 1 additional hour of science learning is quite significantly associated with better performance. And people always say, well, it's the quality, not the quantity that counts. But obviously, outcomes are a product of quality and quantity. You need some time to this. And what this shows is that even if you disregard quality, which we don't measure here, we just look at the time, it does make a difference, 1 hour more at school in a week. 1 hour of private tutoring is negatively associated with performance. That's obviously a selection effect. Those kids go to private tutoring quite obviously because they have some difficulties. But more interestingly here, 1 additional hour of self-study or homework also buys you a bit better performance, but much less than 1 hour in school. And that's an interesting thing for school education, because if you think what is the scarcest resource in education, is not money, it's the student learning time. It's the only thing you can't indefinitely increase. So it's quite striking how different those time factors work out. School activities to promote science learning, I think that's an interesting factor. These are things that don't cost very much money, but do seem to be associated with better outcomes, whether schools do things like science competitions, science exhibitions, sort of making science alive in a school outside formal classrooms. You can see that that is actually related to performance. And we talked already about this. That's basically the local discretion of schools that tends to be associated with performance, but most strongly when you combine it with the fact whether there are external stunts. And the rest of the factors are actually rather small. More public money usually tends to be associated with worse performance, but once you take out social background, you don't see that anymore. Schools with more competing schools tend to be a bit better, but not anymore when you take out social background. So you can actually leave that bar there, but together those school factors, all of them are net factors. Together they add up to quite a bit of variation in performance. Today you can see that PISA, we can account, not explain, but account for about 70% of the performance variability of schools across countries. So we get a pretty clear picture of what accounts for the observed performance variation of schools that we see. Just the last point, and I will stop then. The last point that we observe is that in the best performing education systems, they tend to be highly integrated. Learning opportunities are flexible. There's very little in terms of tracking and streaming and stratification. And they tend to put a lot of emphasis on personalizing, individualizing learning within those kind of integrated structures. So learning opportunities are highly flexible but not rooted in institutional structures. And you can see that, and that's going to be, no, I don't have that slide even here. That's sort of the third dimensions that we have looked at. And we see, for example, that stratification in the system, selection, tracking, streaming in all of its forms, is usually not associated positively with performance, but quite a bit negatively with the impact that social background has on learning outcomes. And then if the European countries that do well today in terms of equity, that's what they learned all early on, that they basically provide integrated education system, put a lot of energy and money into individualizing learning and making up for social difference. And that's something. I think what these international comparisons tell you is that it is quite possible to achieve strong overall outcomes. They show you what is possible in terms of learning outcomes. It's quite possible to achieve relatively equitable learning opportunities, to moderate the impact of social background. And all of that is possible with quite good value for money. That's, I think, the factor that we shouldn't forget. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas.
We just swap
that a clicker? Yeah. If I come down there, I can just stay there. I guess it does. Oh, okay. Okay. Just stay hidden.
Bill, the floor and the computer are yours.
All right. Sounds good. Great presentation, Andreas. Very nice summary of much of the background into which I wish to fit my comments. And I want to pick up mainly on the question that he posed, I think, in his second sort of labeling slide, which how do we get there? I want to say, how does the U.S. get there? I think what he has painted is a very careful picture of just how poorly we fare in these international comparisons, in particular the PISA ones. I would just make one quick comment. I have been involved, as Andreas was. We actually sort of got our baptism in much the same way in the IEA studies, and in particular TIMSS. And those studies, I think, basically show the same kinds of results. They're more curriculum-driven. They're more school-attached in the sense that they usually look at particular grades and then look at the classrooms and look at what the student performance is like. And don't be misled by what you sometimes find in the press, which tends to say that the U.S.'s performance has gotten better from the original TIMSS. It really hasn't. The international mean has changed. Therefore, now we're above it when before we were below it. That's because many of the European countries have dropped out of TIMSS over time, and many more developing countries have joined the study. But basically, if you look at the countries that have participated across the board, the U.S.'s performance has been pretty consistently in the same position, usually starting out in fourth grade somewhat around the middle, ending up below the middle, the international average at the 8th grade, and by the 12th grade, the only time that was done was in the original 95 work, way below at the bottom of the international distribution, both in terms of specialized students in physics and mathematics, calculus in particular, and in terms of general literacy. So that just simply, I wanted to suggest that the results from this other type of international studies give you much the same picture in terms of quality that Andreas has painted for you. I want to answer the question of how do we get there in the U.S. Based on this work as well as some other work that I've been engaged in the United States, and focus on three elements: the curriculum, the teacher, and the parent. Some of these intersect with some of Andreas's, but nicely Andreas goes beyond that to some of the financing and the other control and governance issues as he has described. So that's what I want to focus on, is those three areas. The first one I want to focus on is the area of curriculum. And Andreas spoke to this as being one of the elements of importance here. And I want to simply start with this characterization of what we've learned. Let me just briefly suggest to you how we did this. This was in the original TIM study, and basically what we did was to analyze textbooks from around the world, as well as the varying documents, as he described, that some call national standards, some call curriculum standards. Basically, it was what was specified as to what should be taught in each particular grade level. And so we analyzed these materials in, I think, 30 different languages from about 50 countries at that point in time. And we're able to fairly carefully portray exactly what was being covered at which particular grade levels. In doing that work, we sort of have learned there are three major characteristics of curriculum which differentiate the performance of those countries which typically do quite well at 8th grade and those which do not do as well. And those three characteristics are the three you see up here: coherence, focus, and rigor. Focus has to do with how many topics are covered at a particular grade level. Perhaps the one phrase that has survived everything out of TIMS, the original one, is the mile wide, inch deep, which was a very apt characterization of the fact that in the United States, and you look at any particular grade level, there were very many topics being covered, as opposed to most of the European and other countries, which would focus around a smaller number of topics and cover them deeply in a focused way, instead of trying to cover so many topics that you spend a day on it instead of what other countries might be spending a month on. That's also reflected, by the way, metaphorically as well as in reality, by the textbooks, which an 8th grade textbook in the United States is about 800 pages long. An 8th grade textbook in the rest of the world is about 250 pages long. So that gives you some sense of the issue of the focus. The other one is the rigor, which has to do with the fact that as one moves across the grades, the level of the complexity of the mathematics, and I'm going to focus my comments on mathematics. It also is true in science, but simply for efficiency, I will stay with the mathematics. That basically, by the time you get to the 7th and 8th grade, around most of the rest of the world, it's about algebra and geometry. In the United States, for the vast majority of our students, it's still about fractions, decimals, percents, and ratios. And so there is little movement of the curriculum across the grades. There's a high degree of redundancy over the grades, especially the middle grades, 6, 7, and 8, which I think could be aptly characterized as essentially an intellectual wasteland, simply regurgitating what they did the first 5 years with problems that are a little bit more difficult. And that's hardly movement in a rigorous fashion, as most of the rest of the nations of the world do. The last one is coherence. It's probably singly the most important, and that is, let me simply define coherence. If you take mathematics as an example, but it's true of any of the disciplines, basically what you teach in school is a reflection of the academic discipline from which those topics derive. And the degree to which then, as you take those topics and you sequence them across the year, across the grades, that should be in a way consistent with the internal inherent logical structure of that discipline. In other words, it's not a bunch of arbitrary topics that you can just say, well, what should we teach in first and what should we teach in second? They have to follow the structure of whatever the discipline is. And I suspect this is true of all the disciplines, but especially it's true in math and science. And mathematics even more so, given the very hierarchical nature of mathematics. That is, there are certain things you really can't learn until you learn the prerequisite knowledge in order to understand even the basic ideas of the more complex things. So that's the coherence. If the structure as it's put into the school reflects that inherent logic of the discipline itself. You might ask, what's the opposite? Well, it's sort of a chaotic collection of topics that simply arbitrarily don't fit together and therefore cause vast amounts of confusion to the students as they try to connect. If you if you want an illustration of that, consider fractions. In this country, most kids have absolutely no idea that fractions is essentially part of the number line, that it essentially is an extension of the rational number system. They think this is totally different. None of the rules they learned at first apply to this, when in fact all the field theorems apply to both. So basically, you have this disconnect on many of these topics. Well, I can illustrate the point I want to make to you by the data that we collected. Oh, wrong way, sorry. These are a set of topics down the rows. The particulars are not important here. There are 8 columns. Those are the 8 grades. And what you see in that sort of outline section is where the majority of the top achieving countries essentially cover those topics. 2/3 of the countries, the top achievers, cover those topics at those grade levels. This is not a prescription of what a particular country does. It's in a summary of what the majority of them do, and therefore gives us somewhat of a form of an international benchmark. I point out 2 things to you that, first of all, if you look at first and second grade, that's the illustration of focus. In most of these countries, they cover 3 or 4 topics the whole year. They talk about basic number, place value, operations, and measurement. That's it. They spend the year on that. By contrast, in the United States, we tend to cover 20 or 30 topics. Ask your little child as to what they're trying to learn in first and second grade. The rigor part is if you look at the bottom of that thing and ask yourself whether your 8th grader, if you have one, is covering functions, the rational number system, congruence and similarity, trigonometry, slope, because that's what the vast majority of children, all children in most of these nations, are studying in these other countries. The other last point is coherence. It's just a pattern. You'll notice the topics at the bottom of the list, which are, if you show this to mathematicians, basically they say that's sort of logically structured. It's not the only logical structure, but it is logically structured. That is, the ones at the bottom that necessitate a knowledge of the ones up at the top of the list. And so you don't have dots down there on the lower left-end part of that rectangle that sits there. Well, so you might ask me, what's the alternative? And now turning to what we in the U.S. can do. With that as sort of an international benchmark, this represents some states in which you see dots everywhere. Basically, you see the curricular philosophy of most states, these are unnamed to protect the not-so-innocent, is that you teach everything everywhere because then somehow somebody might learn something somewhere. And I suggest to you that's not particularly a sensible way in the way most other nations put together their curriculum. Well, you know, Andreas talked about in one of his slides the 2 dimensions when looking at the performance, the quality, the high level of performance, together with the equity. And I just want to point out that this issue of curricular coherence, focus, and rigor is really central to what the U.S. I believe essentially it's the foundational one. I believe all the other attempts we make to solve this will not be solved until we address this issue, because what we've created is a system that is incoherently put together, and it affects both of those dimensions. Our performance internationally will not improve, I suggest to you. In a Brookings paper we've done, we looked at these 2 dimensions across 30-some countries, and we find highly significant effects of focus. That is, the more topics, the less well you do, and the more coherent, as measured against that benchmark, the stronger the performance, accounting for upwards of 30% of the variance after accounting for some of the basic GDP-type, demographic-type characteristics. So basically, this is a really important dimension we see internationally. Now, let me show you some of the consequences of our system, that is, this system of incoherent, unfocused, and not so rigorous curricula, combined with this other structural characteristic of our system, which is 50 states, and within those states, 15,000 local school districts. What that produces is essentially something that contributes neither to quality nor to equity. Let me show you this next slide, which says to you, and I'll just ask you the question before I show it to you. If, you know, it's not enough, if you buy the coherence argument, to say that every state covers fractions. Of course they all do. And that's how we often think about this issue. But I suggest to you it's the wrong question. The coverage of fractions is to be connected with the rest of it. And so therefore, in what grades you do this and cover these topics is what's really critical. So if you think about it, you've got 8 grades and you've got these 40-some topics I showed you earlier. Each one of those is a potential combination, a given topic at a given grade level. Now I'll ask you the question. How many of those topic grade combinations would all of our states agree that that should be covered and taught to their children? The answer is none. There isn't a single topic at a single grade level in this nation that all 50 states agree that it should be done for all children. This is the most inequitable system on the face of the earth, I suggest to you. And in fact, the only thing they agree on, the open circles, that's where 100% agree not to teach it. Well, you know, they agree not to teach calculus at first grade. But basically, this sets up
the Koreans do, I think, isn't that right?
Yeah, well, their teachers do, but not they. But you have a system that essentially does not have this coherence, and it's very divergent across the states. And this, of course, is in part a result of this structural feature of our system. I want to show you a couple more slides that sort of speak to this very issue. Here's looking at it's just a set of classrooms. These are a large number of schools, classrooms across this country, 500, 600. If you look at this, it just says how many days of instruction did you spend in teaching certain topics at certain grade levels. Like the first one is grade 2 in arithmetic, a very fundamental worldwide topic at the second grade. Look at the variation. If you exclude the little blue part in the middle, which is sort of where half the classrooms we studied are, look at that enormous amount of variation and ask how equitable such a system is, where in some schools, classrooms, the kids are getting 100+ days of instruction, and in others are getting 20 days of instruction. There always will be some variation in the amount of instruction given in a given topic. But those amounts of variation, as you look at 8th grade and algebra, are just enormous. This is in the fact that we don't have a coherently stated curriculum for all students in the form of some kind of common standards, as he's been talking about, whatever they're called, this prescription, either through an assessment or through formal standards, that says what it is that should be done at each grade level. In the absence of that, we have this enormous variability, first at the state level and then at the classroom level. So the question is, within the No Child Left Behind era, how can we possibly expect all children to learn to the same level when we do not give them the same opportunities in any way, shape, or form? You know, I only mean this in a flip way, but when I look at those data that we've collected over the last several years, I'm writing a book right now called Inequality for All, and basically makes this argument with data that we've gathered all the way from states through districts to schools to classrooms. I actually thought to myself, if I were a lawyer, I'd be actually excited about the possibility of a class action suit on the behalf of all the children in this nation. Because basically we are, and this is a very technical term, we're screwing them. There are large numbers of kids who simply are not being given anywhere near the opportunities they should have if we somehow expect them to perform or not be left behind. So I think this is one of this nation's biggest problems. I think the U.S. showed up on his two-pronged slide as being quite low on the equity issue in terms of performance. Just a couple other slides to illustrate that. Here's a very large U.S. city under the same set of standards. So they have the common standards for all the kids within that district. But this shows you what really happens. Because in the high SES schools, the green and the purple represent about half the school year. That's algebra and geometry, more like the rest of the world. It's actually higher in the rest of the world as a percentage of the 8th grade instruction. But if you look at that, now look at the one on the right, which is the low SES schools, where essentially that's only now about a little bit more than a quarter of the school year. So in the same system where ostensibly they're being told, those parents, that their children are all receiving the same common education, you have this enormous difference of a quarter of a school year. That's a lot of your school year. And essentially what those kids in the low SES get is more of the same basic dumb arithmetic, repetitive stuff, repeating fractions, decimals, percents, and not certainly in any more enticing or intellectually challenging way as just simply more sheets of multiplying, adding, subtracting, and dividing fractions and whatever. So lastly, I want to just show you on that issue that when you look at the districts in this country, Andreas talked about the U.S. not showing up as having very strong local school control. They don't. But if you take away the school and say local control, you have it. And this slide illustrates it. This is from a piece of the TIMS work done in 1999 where 14 districts participated, including Chicago, Miami, Rochester, some of the suburbs around Chicago and Montgomery County, for example, here, and some rural counties in South Carolina and Colorado. So it's not a U.S. sample, but it's a bit of a representation of the variation we tend to find. Well, this slide shows that, in fact, where you have those districts where the higher percentage of the students are taking the more challenging mathematics, the more rigorous stuff, at 8th grade, you see a higher level of performance. And it's a fairly strong, the R-squared is 0.7. I mean, it's 70% of the variance is being accounted for. Even after you account for social class, it's still a very large percent of the variation that's accounted for. So this isn't just a social class issue. This really shows that, in fact, it's not just social class, but it's also the curriculum, the schooling that's making a difference here in this performance. Well, if you then look at the next slide, this is the Achilles heel of our system. That same dimensions now on the vertical axis, what's on the horizontal axis is the SES composition. So those districts, translation, that have the highest percentage of highly educated university graduates essentially are those districts in which the greater challenges are put to the students. So in other words, it's a system based on the education of the parents and the social class of the neighborhoods. That drives the curriculum. So the local school district curriculum essentially adapts itself to the social class conditions in which it resides. And that relationship is equally strong, which essentially then produces this kind of a situation, unlike most of the rest of the world. SES, yes, contributes to student learning everywhere, all countries. The correlation tends to be around 0.6, 0.5, 0.6. So it's there in every country. But when you look at this slide, what we have in the United States is that SES also influences the standards in the curriculum. And so it has both the direct effect as well as the indirect effect, thus exacerbating the effect of social class in this country. And the correlation of SES to performance in this country is among the highest in most of the countries that we studied in TIMS. I think they were up in the top 7, 8 from the top in that regard. So this is producing the kinds of things, the inequities that Andreas was alluding to in that one picture of his. Well, that's the curriculum issue, and I suggest to you that that's one of the major ways in which we need to improve. It's clear we need to move with a curriculum that's more rigorous, more demanding, more coherent. And I suggest to you, this is my bias, my opinion, it will never occur until we confront the issue and have something that specifies common standards for all children in this country. That would remove the inequities, and it would give us a shot to compete more internationally because we would have something coherent. You can't have 50 states playing out the order in which you teach things and somehow expect the textbook writers and the professional development is going to be coherently put together. It's not. That's why we have 800-page textbooks, so they can come to every district in the country and say, this book fits your curriculum. And it does. It fits any curriculum. If anything you could do, it would fit in those books. And so therefore we have this system which is a dead-end system. And until we fix that, and the only way I know how to do that is the current move towards common, call them national, don't call them federal, sort of standards that would specify what each child at each grade level should learn in some fashion, either through assessment procedures or standards or both. And there is, of course, work within the United States. I don't know if Andreas is aware of that, but there's a strong push right now. 40-some states have agreed to look at that issue, and we'll see what happens. That's underway at this very point. Let me just briefly talk about the other 2 points I wanted to make, which the other 2 dimensions that I think we need to think about. Very often when these results come out, at least in the United States, the immediate response is that it's the teachers. We need better teachers somehow, but nobody really knows what that means, and we don't do much to understand what the quality of the teacher is. We have some ideas about that. Well, I want to just show you a couple results from an international study of teacher preparation. There's a big one going on right now. There was a small one we did several years ago with 6 countries in it. And I just want to share with you a couple results from that begin to make a very important point. We actually tested these future teachers. These were students in their last year of teacher preparation. The 3 countries here are Taiwan, Germany, and the United States. And we tested them as to their knowledge of mathematics, as well as their pedagogical mathematics knowledge, as well as their pedagogical, general pedagogy. Could they manage a classroom, things of that sort. I'm just showing you here the knowledge items. And you can see here that Taiwan vastly outperforms the other countries, Germany and the U.S., and the U.S. is the poorest performing among these three countries. It is probably not coincidental that this is somewhat the ordering that you find these countries in with respect to TIMSS and PISA, and especially as Germany itself has made some major shifts in its own educational policies more recently. But of course, that's not a causal inference. I'm not suggesting it. It is a relationship. I like the way Andreas said it. It's something you can at least think about as to being a possible explanatory variable. But then the real question is, well, where does that come from? Well, partly it comes from the fact that those Taiwanese and German teachers were in German and Taiwanese schools in K to 12, and therefore they experienced the difference as I was just suggesting. But also it has, again, comes back to the issue of how they're prepared. And part of that study, we actually looked at their preparation. The size of that circle is how much time they spend, how many course hours they actually spend, clock hours actually is the way we measured it, in their preparation. Most of these, except for Germany, are four-year programs. So Taiwan's big circle just means that those students, future teachers, take so much more during their 4 years than do U.S. students, which is the smallest one. What's most important, though, is the allocation within that, which is the real policy issue this nation is going to have to confront. These were middle school teachers. And you can see in Taiwan, 75% of the coursework they took was in mathematics. In Germany, it was some 60%. In the United States, it was less than 50%. And so the United States, on the other hand, the white area, had a lot of general pedagogy. These are history of philosophy of education, sociology of education, methods of education. We have a lot of that and not as much mathematics. I'm not yet willing to prescribe what the solution to this is, but I think these kind of data suggest very big differences in how these countries prepare their teachers, which I suggest to you says something about their view of what a quality teacher is. Because those teacher preparation institutions presumably spend and allocate the time in preparation in a way that they would think would produce high-quality teachers. The last point I want to just say is something about the parents. I think that's a critical issue in this country because I think that we have many parents that schools suggest are part of the blame for the issue. But I think when you look, we did a large random sample across a major portion of this country in terms of parents, of students in schools. And what we find here is that, you know this, but I just wanted to show you this. The parents of the low SES kids really know that their schools aren't very good, and they clearly indicate that, darn near half of them, the parents indicate that their children are in schools and their schools are failing their kids. They're very poor schools. But I think the real issue I want to show you is this one, which tells an important story that I suggest to you is an important policy issue we have to confront. There are no differences between the three social classes in terms of their motivation. They all want their kids to succeed. They're all big on that. It isn't that the myth that some have that low SES parents just don't care. They don't think education's that important. They do, just as much as everybody else. But what happens then, that's like 70, 80%, 90% feel this. But then when you ask how much they're engaged with their kids, in all cases it drops to 50%. So only about half the parents said they're doing anything with their kids, like helping homework, stopping in the school, engaged with their kids. That big drop, I think, tells us something right there. But again, there's not much in the difference in the way of social class. Now we come to the real answer. Now, this is the knowledge about the system, how you change it, how you work it, how you help your child get ahead, what you need to do if your child is not succeeding. Do you understand this tracking and streaming and ability grouping that Andreas was talking about? And by the way, in the United States, we do it. We do it more than probably any other country in the world, especially in mathematics. We do it in the middle grades. And we have so many different tracks in different schools. And our internal data within the United States say the same thing that he just said internationally. It is a dead end for those children. It is something that doesn't work. What it does is it gives the kids in the high track, the algebra track, a slight advantage, but at the expense of the kids in the regular track. So they'd be better off in a non-track school, they would do better, than to be in a track school in the regular track, even though supposedly the content is the same. So this kind of system is unknown to most of these parents. Now look at the social class difference. Overall, it drops to about a quarter really understanding the school system. And in the lowest SES, it's like less than 10%. So that tells a story. They all want the same thing for their kids, but they're not very heavily involved, and they sure don't know how to help move the system toward the benefit of their kids. No wonder we have the system we do. The parents really want something, but they have no idea what to do about it, and they don't get very engaged in the process. So I suggest to you that these three, just in closing, these three elements are part of the story of an answer to the question of how does the U.S. get there. These are areas that we need to confront as a nation in different ways. I think the federal government, the local governments all have a role in this particular process. And I just end with one positive sort of note. In the most recent TIMSS study, the state of Minnesota participated again, as it had 12 years earlier. I don't know how many of you heard this story. But basically, their performance vastly at fourth grade outperformed the United States. They had a gain over those 12 years 3 times that of the U.S. And among the countries that participated in both of those studies, they were performing just below the top-achieving countries, right up there with just below those top-achieving countries. And the question then is why? And how did they do this? That's a tough question. I don't have the definitive answer. I don't know how to do causal inference in these cases because we don't have the right kind of data. But I can tell you what the data do say. And the data say that essentially the teachers essentially focused their curriculum on the topics that are internationally covered at that grade. They had the coherence, and they cut down on the amount of clutter. They, in other words, much more greatly focused on the relevant, coherent topics. And I'll just give you one statistic. In the 95 study in Minnesota, the teachers reported, their own self-report, half the topics they covered were what we call clutter. They were in the, all those dots that don't belong there. Half the school year was spent on that. In the 2007 results, only 4% was that. Most of the rest of it was focused right on the coherently relevant topics at that particular grade level. I think that shows a path, at least a way that we might think about that this really does make a difference and perhaps is, partly at least, the answer to how we can get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Iris, they're going to give us some good news about American education.
Maybe a little. Actually, about education, there is some good news about education generally, but I'll wait for that. What I'd like to do for my remarks generally is to focus on a set of assumptions about education in the United States and in other countries. This is a short set. I've selected 3, but they form the basis, I think, for much of our rhetoric and many of our policies. And some of these assumptions are basically assumptions, as I said, that drive policies but don't have much support. The first one is that we can fix our schools without addressing the problems of poverty. Now, the remarks I'll make, obviously, because all of us are speaking on generally the same issues. They're going to address some of the same issues, sometimes supporting what others have said from a different perspective, sometimes taking a very different perspective on these issues. The evidence from both the United States and from other countries shows that the achievement gap based on family socioeconomic status is the most significant problem in all countries and accounts for a large variation of the performance among schools in the United States. As Andreas mentioned, the percentage of the variance that is accounted for varies from country to country. But even in countries where the variance looks small, people in the country report the gap in achievement based on socioeconomic status as their major problem. Sweden, for example, with a smaller gap, still perceives that as the major problem. This doesn't mean, of course, in any way that schools and teachers don't have a responsibility to do their best nor does it mean that there's not enormous variation within all types of schools. But it means when you look at schools, the SES is a very large predictor. Now, when we compare U.S. education with education in other countries, we might also want to keep in mind that the United States ranks high on 2 international competitions that we would perhaps prefer not to win. One is that we have the largest income, one of the largest income and wealth gaps between rich and poor when compared with other industrialized countries. And at the same time, we have one of the most unequal systems of school finance. So we might say, yes, we spend a lot of money, but we spend it very unequally. And in a sense, this doesn't show up in our averages as much as it shows up in first what the requirements are in any given school district, poor versus rich, on how the money is spent and what percent goes into instruction, but also how the poor districts within a metropolitan region compare with those around the region and in terms of the resources that they have, because that's where the competition lies with respect to teachers and so forth. Both of these gaps between the rich and poor in the United States, in wealth and income, in school finance, has major consequences for the educational achievement of students from low-income families and for their chances for upward mobility. In recent years, we've tried to close the achievement gap by making our accountability requirements more rigorous. And we made it more rigorous, and I should say more convoluted. And not surprisingly, this remedy has not been effective because it simply doesn't address the underlying problems. A second assumption we make in our discussions about education is that Europe and the rest of the world has solved the problems that we're still struggling with. In editing the book on global education reform, what's most striking, actually, is the extent to which other countries are struggling with precisely the same problems that we are. The conflict between centralization and decentralization, between standardization and school choice, between comprehensive and track schools. But the major problem in all countries is the achievement gap based on socioeconomic status, which no country has been able to solve successfully. And as immigration in many European countries has increased dramatically in recent years, the risk and the concern is that current gaps will become even more pronounced. Now, as I think Andreas has explained very well, when although a country's policies can't eliminate the gap, they can reduce or increase it. Sweden, as I had mentioned before, has a smaller gap than the United States. And a reasonable hypothesis is that Sweden's less extreme gap between rich and poor, its social support system, and its equitable distribution of resources have made a difference. In contrast, and Germany also has been mentioned, the problems of poverty in Germany are exacerbated by a system that tracks students into 3 separate types of schools, typically starting as early as 5th grade, with the bottom track generally serving children from low-income and immigrant families. And it's interesting that what happens in Germany is this is not based on a test. This is based on teacher recommendation and the wishes of the parents. So if you can imagine a 3-track system, and you can imagine the affluent, educated parents arguing with the teacher about where their child should be, even given that the children from that particular group will already have an advantage when they're in school, but all things being equal, those parents can advocate for their children, and the children will then have at least a year to try to make it in the higher track, at which time the parents are probably giving extensive tutoring and so forth. What happens is that you've increased the correlation between socioeconomic class and educational achievement, because the curriculum in these three tracks is very different across the tracks, and the teacher training's different. If you want to teach in the highest track, you go through a more rigorous training procedure. So everything's been done to sort the kids. Now, Germany is certainly aware of this, and what's interesting is that after the results of PISA came out and Finland was on top, all the German ministers, I've heard that every single one of them went off to Finland to see what was happening, and they found out that they weren't tracking. So did they come back and begin to modify the tracking system? No, they did just the opposite. They actually made the tracking system in most states. Germany has a state system, believe it or not a centralized system. It's a state system, and there's some states in Germany that start the tracking a little later, but most started in 5th grade. And they came back and actually made the tracking a little more rigid than they had before. But they decided to focus, sort of like our Title I, focus more attention on the low achieving students. So, but they left the tracking the way it is. Not learning from the experience of other countries doesn't always work if it doesn't fit in with your norms. And there are a lot, Germany. What Germany's gained from this tracking system, it has essentially kept the middle and upper classes in the public school system. So, in any country, there are trade-offs. Turning now to countries which are very different, China and Russia, which are particularly interesting because they're coming out of a period of dramatic political and economic change, and a period of communism. Well, what's happened in these countries is that in recent years, following the changes, they've made major gains, obviously. Many families have escaped from poverty and entered the middle class, and certainly you hear a lot about this in China. But they've also inevitably increased the gap. They've increased the gap between the large number of families who continue to live in poverty and those with extreme wealth, and that social gap is obviously reflected in the achievement gap and in the opportunities available to students at different income levels, and it's very political in those countries, as it is in many others. It's interesting, too, to look at the whole issue of centralization, decentralization, which other countries are dealing with. I mean, many in this country, and Bill has talked a lot about that, believe that if we had a more standardized curriculum, this would address at least some of the problems. Countries are going in both directions. Some countries, like France, which still has a very centralized curriculum, but feels that with the increased diversity and increased immigration, the students are presenting certain issues that the French teachers didn't have to deal with 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and yet they're teaching the same way. They're teaching everybody the same thing, and the national curriculum is very much a matter of pride in France, and that's not going to change. But the rhetoric and the discussion from the government is we've got to ease up. We've got to focus more on our audience. The teachers need to change. What we do in the classroom needs to change. It can't be as completely centralized as it was. And so countries that have been highly centralized are now saying we need to move in the other direction. And countries like the United States are saying, we'll address our problems by becoming more centralized. China and Russia, for example, went in the direction of decentralization. China, which is, an interesting mix of both, but in terms of finance, went through a period where all funding for schools was local. Well, you can imagine what happened because of the gaps in China make our gaps look small. With a huge percentage of the students living in rural areas very poor. That didn't work. The national government in China recently began contributing a lot of the funding to the poor areas, but it hasn't overcome the gap. It's helped, but it hasn't overcome it because the richer areas in China are so much richer and have so many more advantages that the resources there are just enormously different. Okay, the other thing, one other example of how the issues in the United States are very similar to those in other parts of the world. The United States, like many other countries, is faced with difficult policy choices among conflicting goals. And in the United States, perhaps this is most visible in the debate about No Child Left Behind, and the extent to which the tests and perhaps increased standardization in the future will narrow the curriculum. There are also tensions here, as in other countries, between school choice and a concern that this might increase school stratification, and also a tension between, say, the goals of charter schools, which is innovation, and the goals of testing, which really requires everybody to focus on what is being measured in this test, even though in this country that's idiosyncratic to each state. But what's interesting, in terms of looking at this internationally, is that these types of tension are occurring in countries throughout the world. And let me give one example from Europe, and that's England. In England, families can choose from among a wide range of schools, including academies intended to provide alternative education options. But the variation among these options is very limited by the national curriculum and tests. The school simply cannot move too far afield when the most important thing to the children and families is to do well in the test. The school choice in England is also leading to a concern that the education system will be increasingly defined by socioeconomic status, and this will increase the stratification in the country. Now, testing practices also limit attempts to revise curricula in other countries, and Turkey, Japan, and China are three interesting examples. And I would just like to refer to what Andreas mentioned, and that is most countries in the world do not use test scores to evaluate teachers. They do not hold teachers accountable for students' test scores. And Turkey, Japan, and China, none of them do. But of course, testing is very important in these countries from the perspective of what happens to the student. I should mention, though, in terms of test-based accountability, that in very recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, some countries in Europe have begun to move in that direction. And it's interesting, as the United States is very aware now of all the problems, some of these countries are moving in that direction, but it's still the minority of the countries if you look worldwide. Okay, Turkey, Japan, and China. Everybody's familiar with exams there. They're not used to hold teachers accountable. They're high stakes for the kids. They're extremely stressful, anxiety-provoking, and are a major part of the students' lives, particularly as they get to the higher grade levels. China, and it has created some interesting trade-offs. All of these countries, all of them, have been trying to reduce the emphasis on rote learning and to encourage what these countries consider to be a more in-depth curriculum, more emphasis on problem-solving, creativity, etc. And what China has done to try to encourage that, which is, a very smart idea, is they have made some revisions in the tests, because all countries know that what's tested is what's taught and what's learned. So China has changed the test to make the test more reflective of the kinds of skills they're trying to encourage in the classroom. And what's happened is that because the more innovative classroom programs are to be found in the richer areas, in the top economic zones, and not throughout the country, the parents from the poorer areas and the teachers are saying, we can't teach this. This is not what's happening here. And if you change the test, our kids will be at a big disadvantage. And our kids have been, their only way out of poverty is to pass these tests. And although a relatively small number do, it's their way out of poverty. And if you change the tests to be more complicated and what most of us would call more interesting, then our kids are more likely to fail and we'll lose our route out of poverty. The same thing is happening in Turkey, which has tried to reduce the emphasis on rote learning. They're exactly the same things. The tests, the kids are more likely to do well in the tests if they stay with the old system. Japan, which has always, at least to us, appeared to score very high in tests, a few years ago also wanting to move away from the traditional rote learning emphasis on basic skills, introduced more electives, into what they call integrated curriculum, and with the goal being, and I'm quoting, to give Japanese students a zest for life. Well, what happened was that the next round of testing came, and although they still scored very high, they saw a slight decline. And I guess they decided, at least for the older kids, that was enough of a zest for life. They gave, and this is sort of surprising, you wouldn't expect this in Japan, they gave their first national test since 1964. First time they tested, and I'm not talking about university entrance, this was a NAEP type thing, just a national assessment across the country. And then the Prime Minister of Japan publicly apologized to all of the students and families in Japan for changing the curriculum and thereby lowering test scores when the previous curriculum had appeared to serve the country so well. So what they have done now, and it's interesting, when a country backtracks, it doesn't go all the way. Their curriculum is still different now than it was. So what they've done is they've cut back on the integrated studies, on the electives, on the zest for life, but they've kept some of it. So it's not gone from the curriculum. It's just been reduced. But what's most interesting is the apology from the Prime Minister, which is so different from what would happen here. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, there's one more assumption, and I'll just make a couple of points about it, which somehow moves in a different direction in a way, but it's an assumption that guides at least a lot of our rhetoric and some of our policies, and in my view, identifies the wrong problem and therefore is not productive in making improvements that will strengthen education. And that's the assumption that a country's rank on international test score comparisons predicts its ability to compete in the global economy. I'm talking now about industrialized countries. I'm not talking about among poor countries where obviously improving the education system will make a difference. But I'm talking about the industrialized countries where with all of the problems, all of the countries are educating a significant number of students to a high level. And there's a long history of drawing that sort of inference. It began with the Soviet Union when Sputnik went up, and that was a long time ago. Moved on to Japan and concerns about competitiveness from Japan, industrial management, trade balance, etc. And now, of course, is China and India. And I would just like to pose a few brief questions, which I'll leave for you to answer. Did the United States lose the leather, textile, and steel industries because of its rankings on test score comparisons? Is our auto industry in trouble, and that of Japan, by the way, because students don't do well in math? Well, it certainly would be hard for Japan to claim that. Is there a shortage of U.S. scientists, as some firms have reported, or is there a shortage at the level the firms would prefer to pay? Are firms outsourcing jobs to China and India because Americans can't do them, or because of the wage differential? Is the underrepresentation of native-born U.S. students in science and math and engineering because of a failure of our education system, and these are, by the way, in science, math, and engineering PhD program, or because there have been, at least until recently, more lucrative opportunities in fields like investment banking, law, and business? Perhaps the economic recession will bring more students back into the science fields, but perhaps not, because it may be, given what we read about Goldman Sachs in the last few days, the investment banking business is just as lucrative as it ever was. And that draws a lot of mathematicians and a lot of physicists among American students. And, of course, there is enormous movement of both workers and investments around the world. So when we talk about what's happening in an individual country in terms of education, we have to see it in that context. So my basic question is, do we believe that our problems in economic competitiveness would be solved or even alleviated if students answered more questions correctly on the international comparisons? None of that is to say that strengthening education is important, but it does say that we're more likely to make a difference, to look both at the education system, but perhaps more important, to look at societal issues like poverty if we want to make a real difference. Now, somebody said, you asked if I was going to say something positive. So let me say this for the end, and this also goes back to something Andreas said about access. I think that our emphasis on problems often obscures the positive trends that have occurred both in the United States and throughout the world. And most important is the enormous expansion of access at all levels of education for diverse population groups. It's dramatic, and it's dramatic not just in rich countries, but even more in poor countries, and countries like China and Turkey and so forth. The growth has been very large. In some countries, these changes are in the early stages. Talking now about access to higher education. In the United States, they've been and some other countries, they've been going on for years. And I think, when you look at this over a period of several years, the gains in most countries seem small. But when a longer time frame is considered, it's clear that major positive change has occurred. And just looking at the United States, but it's happening in other countries, change both for the individuals involved and for the society as a whole. In the United States, of course, the increase in access began very early first with the GI Bill of Rights, and then with the enormous increase of minorities participating in higher education, which went along with the growth of the civil rights movement. And what that means is that expansion brought many families and their descendants out of poverty and contributed to a dramatic increase in educational opportunity and to achievement for generations of children, and still can do that. I think that's a reason for optimism, but it also means that we have to pay close attention to our policies, including economic and social policies and student financial aid policies, which will make a big difference in whether or not this trend will continue. Thank you very much.
We've had such rich presentations, we only have time for a couple questions. This trio of stars are going to go up to Capitol Hill and talk to a group up there about very much the same kind of thing. The challenges that we face, the opportunities, that mix of whether it the good news, I think that societal factors are important but vary in countries depending on what social policies are adopted. And, of course, being a Sputnik-era kid, I would probably answer all Iris's questions a little differently than she would. Let's turn it quickly to a couple questions. The gentleman in the back there with the red tie.
Thank you. I was impressed by
If you could introduce yourself, please.
I'm J.V. Martinez. I'm with the Department of Energy. I was impressed by the report that Dr. Schmidt said about Minnesota, and I wondered to that extent what might be the difference between the schools of education in Minnesota versus the other states. And also another question I have is the role of unions in America in terms of innovation and teaching, and how that might compare to other countries. Thank you.
I handle the first one. I don't know the answer to your question about the differences in the schools of education in Minnesota. I think what's more important, perhaps, to that immediate impact is that after the international benchmarking stuff that I shared with you came out, Minnesota worked very closely, actually, with us to keep sort of evaluating their evolving standards. And as they did this, they became more focused and coherent. But I think the other major part was they then created a set of documents that would help translate those to teachers as to what they needed to do as they were in the classroom to actually achieve those particular standards. And I think that bridge from the standard to what the teachers were actually doing. It's another thing that Japan does. I mean, they have documents that try to connect what the standards are to the practices in the classroom. I think that helps because the teachers were able to then focus themselves around those issues instead of going across everything. And as I said earlier, I think that may be the major stimulus for that improvement. And it also, I didn't mention before, but it's starting to show up at the 8th grade too. And although the eighth graders only had about half their time in this new standards, they didn't have the base ones at the beginning. So 4 years from now, we'll see whether their eighth graders continue this trend.
Iris, I was going to ask, before we get to the union question,
Yeah.
might there be a difference in the income gap in some states around the country?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. In comparing states on test scores, it's very interesting, and I wish I had it with me, to look at our NAEP scores and then look at the proportion of children living in poverty in each state. Very high relationship. You know, we talk, PISA's paid a lot of attention to socioeconomic status, but when we talk about comparisons within our own country, yes, we do in connection with No Child Left Behind, but when we rank states and so forth, we often don't pay attention to that. And so the proportion of low-income children in any given state will have a very large relationship, high relationship with the scores on NAEP. And of course, if you look at, as a side, if you look at the scores on the SAT, which is highly selective, then it'll be highly related to the proportion taking the test, because some states have 5% taking it. Just a brief comment on unions. Some countries, and France is a prime example. I don't know if you've noticed recently all the articles about France in the newspaper. The strength of the teachers' union in France makes ours look like it's almost not here. I mean, that is a very strong union. They protest everything. They go on strike. They, very, very active, strong union. So if we look for a correlation between test scores and whether or not the role of the union, at least in France and some other European countries, we would find, France scores high, we would find that the union, is extremely strong.
I wanted to
go to the lady in the
add a really quick comment. I feel compelled to say this, and it also, I think, is an indication of something positive, since we're looking for positive things, and that is, I for no moment would deny the impact of social class and what Iris was just talking about. But I do want to indicate that when you look at the analyses that we've done, both across districts and across states, if you take into account the social class differences which do exist, and you also have measures of content, exposure, the opportunities, and you put both of those in the same analysis, in the same model, what you we have found is that the effect of the content, the opportunity, is about twice the size of the social class. I go back to my point of a few moments ago, and that is the reason social class and what she's reporting has such a powerful impact in this country is because it also impacts what they get to study. So if you put in, most of the analyses of social class don't have content measures. So when you put in opportunity or content in an equation together with the SES, you can begin to parse those things apart. And very surprisingly and positively, in the one analysis we did across a national sample of classrooms and schools, we found the effect size for the content to be twice that of the social class impact. So I think there is some good news. Yes, social class is going to always be there, but I think if we can undo the linkage of social class to content, then I think we can begin to make progress and give all kids at least a decent shot.
Let's go to that last question.
My name is Anastasia Fakhrudinova. I'm with Woodrow Wilson Center Scholar here, Kennan Institute, and actually I'm from Russia, and I'm an associate professor of Educational University. My question is, actually I have two questions, if you can answer them. The first question is, when you showed the preparedness of the teachers in Taiwan, Germany, and United States, mathematics teachers, you showed that Taiwan teachers spent more time on education. That's probably the reason why their math teaching is better. But don't you think that it doesn't go with the level, with the amount of time which they spent on the math teaching, studying, and probably the problem is in the preparation of teachers how to teach math. Because, for example, I know a lot of cases when university teachers go to school, they have excellent knowledge of math and they cannot teach children because they don't know what to do with them. That's the first thing. And the second thing, the second question is, you were talking about the standardization, so making mathematics study more central in the United States. I'm studying civic education, citizenship education here. So there are a lot of standards. So each state has standards on citizenship education. But then the programs which are presented by different centers, excellent programs, but they don't cover all the topics which go in this standard. So even if the state has the standard, they don't cover all the points of this. And it's not the exact question. The exact question is, America is very sensitive to English language and to mathematics. And will there be any changes in other subjects, so to make them more centralized? So you told that educators from 47 states decided to make some central standards for math. Will there be any movements towards other different subjects, like history, geography, which are also not...
Since the panel has to run, let's go quickly. Who would like to take...
I'll take
Bill?
those and at least start. To your second question first, and that is, yes, I think that those people who believe in the importance of having this, which many of the other nations do have standards, the 10 we studied intensely have standards in most of the areas you just identified, including Russia. And therefore, I think the United States' intent is to move in that direction. But it was felt that initially the two that are most pushed and most thought of, because basically they're so basic to everything else, is language and mathematics. So it is just a starting point. I think that there is clear intention to move beyond that to include some kind of standards. But politically everybody's afraid of that, because trying to set, you said civics, it's sort of broaden that to history and that. Can you imagine the 50 states agreeing on whether, some battle in Virginia should be in the national standards versus some battle in Michigan? This is the problem and why they're steering clear of that initially. To your first question, no, you're absolutely right. Pedagogical content knowledge is very important, and we studied that as well. One of the problems of a short presentation is you have to hit certain points and move on. But clearly, if you looked at that one graph, in Taiwan especially, they spent a lot of time on mathematical content pedagogical knowledge. They dealt with pedagogy at the most practical of levels. And that's, again, different from the U.S., where they dealt with pedagogical knowledge, but it wasn't really very practical. It was, again, a more abstract thing. And I think those are the kind of issues that will emerge, perhaps, out of the policy implications from the bigger study.
Well, I'm very sorry to have to stop there. We've got to get the team up to the hill, but please join me in a round of applause. Each of the speakers, and I'm very much including Iris in this, posed a series of serious questions. Do we have a shortage of scientists? Do we pay them enough? Do we get what we celebrate? Has it all been investment bankers as opposed to the people who invented the iPod and so forth and so on? So we're going to return to those questions. So keep tuned. And thank you all for joining us this morning.